The conference room was a flurry of muted conversations and clinking coffee mugs, but Megan had tuned it all out. She sat at the far end of the table, her laptop open to a half-finished presentation, a faint smile of satisfaction on her lips. Everything was finally falling into place. Her phone buzzed against the polished oak table. A glance at the screen made her heart skip. Jake. They hadn't spoken much in the past month, his excuses about late nights at work becoming routine, but something about this call felt different. Jake, she answered, her voice low but firm. Hey, Megan. His tone was unnervingly casual, with that smug undertone she'd grown to despise over the years. Just wanted to let you know, I've filed for divorce. For a moment, she thought she'd misheard him. What? Yeah. I mean, it's obvious we're not working anymore, right? No point dragging this out. I've also sold the apartment. Got a great offer last week, and it's a done deal. What are you talking about? Her voice trembled, but her mind raced. You sold our apartment? Without me. Jake chuckled, the sound sharp and grating. It's my name on the papers. Don't act surprised, Megan. You always said you hated that place anyway. I did you a favor. Megan shot to her feet, her chair screeching against the floor. A few heads turned, but she didn't care. You had no right to make that decision without me. Relax, Jake drawled. You'll get your share, eventually. Maybe even enough to start over. Not that you ever contributed much to the mortgage. Her knuckles whitened as she gripped her phone. How dare you? You'll thank me one day, he said breezily, as though he were discussing dinner plans. Anyway, I've got a flight to catch. Good luck, Megan. The line went dead. Megan stood frozen, the phone still pressed to her ear. Her colleagues were watching now, their murmurs of concern washing over her like static. But all she could hear was Jake's smug voice echoing in her mind. Her stomach churned with a mix of fury and disbelief. For years, she'd ignored the cracks in their marriage, chalking them up to stress and routine. But this was something else. This wasn't just betrayal, it was calculated, cold, and utterly cruel. She sank back into her chair, her heart pounding. The presentation on her screen was forgotten. Her life as she knew it had just been upended, and not by accident. Jake had made sure of that. But even as tears pricked at her eyes, Megan felt something stir deep within her. A spark. A determination she hadn't felt in years. Jake thought he could steamroll her life and walk away unscathed. He thought she was weak, that she'd crumble. He had no idea who he was dealing with. Megan clenched her fists. She wasn't just going to fight back, she was going to win. Megan sat alone on her couch, staring blankly at the skyline outside her window. The city lights twinkled, oblivious to the chaos unfurling in her life. Her mind replayed the phone call with Jake, the sharpness of his words, and the cruel finality of them. She reached for the glass of wine she'd poured, her fingers trembling. But as the liquid burned down her throat, the haze of disbelief began to lift, leaving behind a stark, cold clarity. This wasn't a sudden betrayal, it had been years in the making. Jake had always been charming, the kind of man who could light up a room with his confidence. When they'd met, she'd been drawn to his ambition, the way he spoke about his dreams with such conviction. He made her feel special, seen in a way no one else had. But as she sat there, tracing the threads of their 8 years together, a different picture began to emerge. There had been signs, small, dismissive comments Jake would make when she disagreed with him. "You're overthinking it, Megan," he'd say, brushing off her concerns about decisions that affected them both. Or, "Relax, I've got this," when she dared to challenge his choices. At first, she thought he was just confident, a man who knew what he wanted. But now, those words rang hollow, masking a deeper truth. Jake never valued her input. She thought back to the first time she'd felt truly sidelined. It was their 3rd anniversary. She had spent weeks planning a weekend getaway, excited to surprise him. But when she told him about it, he laughed. "That sounds great," he said, "but I've already booked a trip to Vegas with the guys. You should have checked with me first." She'd been crushed, but he'd smoothed it over with flowers and apologies, promising to make it up to her. She let it go, convincing herself that relationships were about compromise. Then there was the way he controlled their finances. Jake handled the bills, the mortgage, even her retirement contributions. He'd always insisted it was easier that way since he was good with numbers. She trusted him, never questioning the arrangement. But now she wondered how much he'd hidden behind that facade of financial management. And then there were his absences. The late nights at work that stretched into weekends. The business trips that conveniently fell over holidays. She had trusted his excuses, even when his answers felt too polished, too rehearsed. Now, with his sudden divorce announcement and the sale of their apartment, those memories sharpened into painful clarity. Jake's actions weren't careless or impulsive, they were calculated. Megan reached for her laptop, her fingers flying over the keys as she opened her banking app. Her heart sank. Their joint account was practically empty. She checked the savings account. Nothing. Panic clawed at her chest, but she forced herself to breathe. She didn't know the full extent of Jake's betrayal yet, but one thing was certain: he'd been planning this for a long time. As the realization settled over her, Megan felt her trust in Jake dissolve completely. Every kind word, every shared memory, every promise, they were tainted now, rewritten by his selfishness and manipulation. Her grip tightened on the wine glass as anger replaced the hurt. Jake had underestimated her, counting on her to stay quiet and compliant. But Megan wasn't the woman she was 8 years ago. She'd been broken before, and she'd rebuilt herself then. She could do it again. This time, though, she wasn't just rebuilding. She was preparing for war. Megan sat at the small dining table, papers scattered around her like the debris of a life imploding. Bills, bank statements, and legal documents she'd dug out of the file cabinet filled every corner of the table. Each piece was a puzzle, slowly forming the image of Jake's calculated betrayal. But it was the mortgage paperwork that caught her attention. She leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she read the document. Her pulse quickened. It was the deed to the apartment. A memory surfaced, a refinancing agreement they'd signed 2 years ago when Jake was angling for better rates. At the time, she'd hesitated to co-sign. "Why don't we just transfer the deed entirely to you?" Jake had said, dismissing her concerns with his usual charm. "It'll make the process cleaner, and I'll still handle everything." She'd been so relieved to get the refinance approved that she didn't think much of it. She signed the documents and handed them over without a second glance. Jake had practically shoved them into an envelope, grinning as he said, "All set." And now, staring at the paperwork, it hit her: the apartment wasn't his to sell. It was hers. Her name alone was on the deed. Jake had assumed he still held full control, blinded by his arrogance. He'd underestimated her, as he always did, never imagining she'd bother to look into the details. Megan's lips curled into a grim smile. This wasn't just a mistake on Jake's part, it was leverage. She sank back in her chair, adrenaline coursing through her veins. The despair and helplessness that had weighed her down since the phone call began to lift, replaced by a steely determination. Jake had played his hand, confident he held all the cards, but this one detail could change everything. She grabbed her phone and dialed her lawyer, a sharp-witted woman named Alyssa who had handled Megan's last promotion contract. When Alyssa answered, Megan cut straight to the point. "I need your help," she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil beneath it. "Jake's trying to divorce me and sell our apartment without my consent. But I just found out he can't. The apartment is in my name." There was a pause on the line, then Alyssa's voice sharpened. "That's a significant detail. He legally can't sell property that doesn't belong to him." "Megan, this changes everything." "I need to stop the sale," Megan said. "I'll handle it," Alyssa assured her. "But listen to me. Don't let him know you've figured this out yet. Let him keep thinking he's in control. It'll give us the upper hand." Megan hung up and set her phone down, her mind racing. Jake had built a web of lies and manipulations, but now she had a thread to unravel it. For the first time in days, Megan felt like she could breathe. Jake's betrayal had shaken her, but it had also woken something fierce inside her. He thought he could take everything from her. But Megan wasn't about to let that happen. Megan sat at her desk, her phone pressed to her ear as she listened to the smooth, composed voice of Charlotte Dawson, her lawyer, and one of the few people she trusted implicitly. The two had been friends since college, bonding over late-night debates and shared dreams of independence. If anyone could help her now, it was Charlotte. "This is worse than I thought," Charlotte said after Megan finished recounting the situation. "Jake didn't just cross a line, he obliterated it. Selling a property that isn't in his name? That's outright fraud." Megan felt a flicker of relief at Charlotte's confidence, though her stomach still churned with unease. "Can we stop the sale?" "Yes, absolutely," Charlotte replied. "I'll file an immediate cease and desist with the buyer and their attorney. Once they see the deed is in your name, they won't touch the deal." "But Megan, this is just the beginning. Jake's behavior indicates he's willing to play dirty. We need to prepare for a battle. Where do we start?" Megan asked, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. "First, we'll ensure your ownership of the apartment is ironclad," Charlotte said. "I'll pull the deed, title history, and any associated paperwork to confirm there's no loophole Jake can exploit. Then, we need to address the financial accounts. How much access does he have to your personal finances?" Megan winced. "Too much. He managed everything, our joint accounts, savings, even my retirement fund. I barely checked them because he always said he had it under control." Charlotte's sigh was audible through the phone. "Classic manipulation tactic. We'll freeze any joint accounts immediately and redirect your personal assets into a secure account. That way, Jake can't siphon anything else while we work." Megan jotted down notes as Charlotte outlined the steps. It felt overwhelming, but with each word, a weight lifted. She wasn't alone in this fight anymore. "There's something else," Megan said hesitantly. "What about the divorce itself? Can he just blindside me like this?" Charlotte's tone softened. "He can file, yes, but his behavior won't look good in court. Divorces are messy, but with his fraudulent actions, we have the chance to turn this in your favor. Megan, we're not just going to defend your rights, we're going to make sure Jake faces the consequences of his choices." A grim determination settled over Megan. "Let's do it. Whatever it takes." Charlotte chuckled lightly. "Now that's the Megan I know. All right, I'll send over some documents for you to review and sign. In the meantime, gather anything you can, emails, financial records, even texts from Jake that might show his intentions. The more we have, the stronger our case." After hanging up, Megan leaned back in her chair, letting out a slow breath. The apartment was safe for now, and Charlotte had a plan in motion. Jake had underestimated her, again. She glanced at the papers spread across her desk. This wasn't just about protecting what was hers. It was about reclaiming the power Jake had stolen from her over the years, piece by piece. Megan picked up her pen, a fire igniting within her. The legal battle was only beginning, and she was ready to fight for everything she deserved. The apartment was eerily quiet as Megan stepped inside, her heels clicking against the polished wood floors. She glanced around at the space she had once considered her sanctuary, now tainted by Jake's betrayal. She set her bag down on the counter, the weight of the day pressing against her shoulders. But tonight, she was ready. Charlotte had sent over the cease and desist letter earlier in the day, and Megan knew Jake would receive it soon, if he hadn't already. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind, prepared to face his inevitable outrage. The sound of the front door slamming made her flinch, but she quickly straightened. Jake strode in, his face flushed with anger. A crumpled letter was clutched in his fist. "What the hell is this, Megan?" he demanded, shaking the paper at her. She crossed her arms, keeping her expression calm despite the tension crackling in the air. "It's a legal document. You know, to stop you from committing fraud." Jake's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing. "Fraud? Don't be ridiculous. I'm doing what's best for both of us, selling that place so we can move on. You're just being petty." Megan tilted her head, her voice cool and measured. "Petty? Jake, the apartment is in my name. You don't have the legal right to sell it." His smug demeanor faltered for a split second, but he quickly recovered, scoffing. "You don't know what you're talking about. I've handled everything with this place since day one. That's true, Megan said, stepping closer. You did handle it, right up until we refinanced 2 years ago. Remember that? You signed the deed over to me to make the process easier. I have the paperwork to prove it, Jake. His face went pale, and for the first time, he looked genuinely unsure. That doesn't matter. I've been paying the mortgage. And I've been contributing to our household in plenty of other ways, she interrupted, her voice firm. That doesn't change the fact that the apartment belongs to me now. You've made a habit of ignoring me, of dismissing my value, but this is my line in the sand. Jake's hands clenched into fists, the letter crumpling further. You think this means you've won? This is just the beginning, Megan. You don't know what you're getting into. A flicker of anger flared in her chest, but she refused to let it show. Instead, she took a slow, deliberate step forward, meeting his gaze with unwavering resolve. No, Jake. You don't know what you've started. He stared at her, his usual confidence visibly shaken. For years, he had controlled every aspect of their life together, assuming she would always bend to his will. But now, the balance of power had shifted, and he didn't know how to handle it. Leave, Megan said, her voice steady. You're not welcome here anymore. And don't even think about trying anything else. Charlotte and I are ready for whatever move you make next. Jake hesitated, his anger warring with something else, fear, maybe, or disbelief. Then, without another word, he turned and stormed out, slamming the door behind him. Megan stood there for a moment, the tension slowly ebbing from her body. She let out a shaky breath, her hands trembling slightly as the adrenaline wore off. But beneath the exhaustion, a spark of triumph burned bright. Jake had underestimated her for the last time. This was her home, her life, and she was reclaiming it piece by piece. Days turned into a week, and Megan began to sense a shift in Jake's demeanor. His once cocky, overconfident attitude was cracking under the pressure. She expected him to lash out, but the combination of her unwavering stance and Charlotte's meticulous legal strategy seemed to have cornered him. The first sign of his unraveling came in the form of incessant texts. Jake, this is ridiculous, Megan. We're adults. We should settle this privately. No need for lawyers. Jake, you can keep the apartment if that's what you want. Just let me get my share. Jake, are you even reading these? Megan ignored them, forwarding the messages to Charlotte as instructed. She knew better than to respond, especially now that Jake was flailing. The second sign came when he showed up unannounced at her office. Megan was in the middle of reviewing a report when her assistant buzzed through. There's a man here to see you. Says it's urgent, the assistant said hesitantly. Megan's stomach clenched. Is his name Jake? Yes. Should I call security? She hesitated, then exhaled. No, send him up. But let Charlotte know what's happening. Minutes later, Jake appeared in her doorway, his hair disheveled and his face drawn tight with frustration. She didn't offer him a seat. What are you doing here, Jake? She asked coldly. I came to talk, he said, his voice straining to sound calm but failing. This whole situation is out of hand, Megan. We need to fix it before it gets worse. She folded her arms. Fix it? You mean undo the mess you created by lying and trying to sell something that isn't yours? That's rich, even for you. Jake's jaw tightened. I didn't lie. I made a mistake. And I'm trying to make it right. Why are you being so difficult? Megan let out a humorless laugh. Difficult? You tried to steal from me, Jake. Forgive me for not trusting your sudden interest in doing the right thing. He ran a hand through his hair, his frustration boiling over. I just need my share, Megan. I have debts to pay, things you don't understand. There it was. The truth beneath the bravado. Megan felt a pang of satisfaction as she watched the man who once held all the power in their marriage crumble. This isn't my problem anymore, she said, her voice sharp. You made your choices. Now you get to live with the consequences. Jake's face darkened. You're going to regret this. I can make things very difficult for you. She stepped forward, meeting his glare with calm defiance. You already tried, Jake. It didn't work. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a meeting to get to. Don't ever show up here again. Jake's desperation escalated in the days that followed. He called mutual friends, spinning tales of Megan's supposed vindictiveness, trying to turn them against her. But the people who knew Megan saw through his manipulations, offering her quiet support instead. Charlotte, as always, was a fortress of calm amid the storm. "He's panicking," she said during one of their late-night calls. "That means our strategy is working. Keep ignoring him and documenting everything. He's bound to make a mistake we can use." And Jake did. One evening, Megan received a call from Charlotte, her voice laced with triumph. "He tried to take out a loan against the apartment," she said. "The lender flagged the deed and called me when they realized he wasn't the owner." Megan felt her heart race. "What does that mean?" "It means he's desperate and sloppy," Charlotte said. "I've already filed a complaint. This is more evidence for our case, and it strengthens your position. Stay the course, Megan. You're winning." As Megan hung up, she allowed herself a small smile. Jake's world was crumbling, and no amount of manipulation could save him now. She wasn't just fighting to protect what was hers anymore. She was fighting for her independence, her peace, and her future. And she was winning. The knock at the door came late in the evening, sharp and impatient. Megan was curled up on the couch with a cup of tea and the latest draft of her legal filings, but the moment she heard it, she knew. Jake. She stood, her heartbeat steady but purposeful. She had been expecting this, the escalation, the audacity. What she wasn't expecting was the woman standing beside him when she opened the door. Emily. Megan recognized her immediately from social media. The carefully posed photos Jake had insisted were work events, the woman with the bright smile and painfully obvious adoration for the man standing beside her. She wasn't surprised Jake had cheated, but seeing his betrayal standing on her doorstep, that was a new kind of low. "Jake," Megan said coolly, crossing her arms. "What do you want?" "We're here to stay," Jake said, his voice laced with false bravado as he pushed past her, dragging a suitcase behind him. Emily followed hesitantly, clearly uncomfortable under Megan's sharp gaze, but clinging to Jake's arm nonetheless. She had the look of someone who believed in her lies because they were more comfortable than the truth. Megan didn't move from her spot by the door. "Excuse me? You think you can just walk in here?" Jake spun to face her, his smirk firmly in place. "Megan, let's not make this harder than it needs to be. I know you've been playing your little legal games, but the apartment is just as much mine as it is yours. We need a place to stay for a while, so this is happening." Emily looked around nervously, clearly expecting some kind of domestic scene. Instead, Megan smiled. "Oh, Jake," she said, her voice dripping with mock sympathy. "I guess you missed the part where this apartment is mine. Legally. You have no right to be here." Jake's smirk faltered. "Don't be ridiculous. I've lived here for years." "Sure," Megan said, stepping closer. "But you don't own it. And after your little stunt trying to sell it without my consent? You're lucky I don't call the police right now and have you removed." Emily's eyes widened, her hand falling from Jake's arm. "Jake, what is she talking about?" Megan turned her attention to Emily, her tone sharp but controlled. "Did he tell you the truth, Emily? About how he tried to sell this apartment out from under me? Or how he emptied our joint accounts while I was at work?" Emily's mouth opened, but no words came out. She looked at Jake, her expression shifting from confusion to suspicion. "Megan, enough," Jake snapped, stepping between them. "This isn't your business." Megan laughed, a cold, cutting sound. "Not my business? Jake, you're standing in my apartment with your mistress, demanding I let you stay. Everything about this is my business." Jake clenched his jaw, but Megan didn't stop. "You've lied, you've cheated, and now you're dragging her into this mess because you're too much of a coward to face the consequences of your actions." She turned back to Emily, her voice softening just enough to drive the point home. "He'll do the same to you, you know. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but one day he will." Emily flushed, pulling her purse closer as if it could shield her from the truth. I didn't know," she stammered. Jake grabbed her arm, his voice harsh. "Emily, don't listen to her. She's just bitter." "I think you should go," Megan interrupted, her voice firm. "Both of you." And if you try to come back, Jake, I'll make good on that police call. Jake glared at her, his mask of control slipping entirely. You're going to regret this, Megan. Not as much as you will, she shot back. With that, Jake grabbed the suitcase and stormed out, Emily trailing behind him. Megan closed the door with a satisfying click, leaning against it as the tension began to drain from her body. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. Jake's web of lies was unraveling, and Megan was finally stepping into her power. The silence in the apartment was different now, calm, not oppressive. Megan stood in the center of the living room, taking in the emptiness Jake had left behind. The clutter of his belongings, the chaos of his presence, even the lingering tension in the air, it was all gone. She had insisted he take every last thing when he left. The mismatched couch he'd picked out, the beer glasses from his favorite brewery, even the hideous abstract painting he'd claimed was an investment. Now, the apartment was hers to shape, a blank canvas waiting for something new. Megan rolled up her sleeves. It started with the bedroom. She stripped the sheets, tossing them into a donation bag along with the duvet Jake had insisted on buying because it was practical. She replaced them with soft, jewel-toned linens she'd picked out for herself, a small luxury that felt like a rebellion. The kitchen was next. Megan cleared out the cabinets, discarding the coffee mugs Jake had collected from his endless business trips and the kitchen gadgets he'd never used but insisted on keeping. She filled the space with things that brought her joy, vibrant dishes, a vintage tea set she'd been eyeing for years, and a sleek coffee machine she'd bought on a whim. By the time her friends arrived, she was knee-deep in cardboard boxes and new beginnings. Megan, Charlotte called out as she stepped inside, balancing a pizza box in one hand and a bottle of wine in the other. Behind her were three of Megan's closest friends, each carrying something, a potted plant, a stack of books, and a toolkit. I see the reinforcements have arrived, Megan said with a laugh, wiping a streak of dust from her cheek. Charlotte set the wine down and hugged her. We're here to help. New chapter, new space, right? The evening became a whirlwind of activity. Charlotte and one friend tackled the living room, rearranging furniture and hanging new artwork Megan had bought. Another friend helped Megan build a new bookshelf, filling it with paperbacks and cherished trinkets. They laughed as they worked, the sound filling the apartment with warmth Megan hadn't realized it was missing. By the time they sat down to eat, the transformation was almost complete. The apartment didn't just look different, it felt different. Lighter, brighter, and unmistakably hers. As they sipped wine and admired their handiwork, Charlotte raised her glass. To Megan, she said, her voice full of pride. To standing up for yourself, reclaiming your space, and building something beautiful out of the mess he left behind. Megan smiled, her heart full. To all of you, she replied, clinking her glass against theirs. For reminding me I don't have to do this alone. That night, as her friends left and the apartment settled into its new quiet, Megan lit a candle and sat by the window, watching the city lights twinkle. The apartment was more than a home now. It was a sanctuary, a reflection of her resilience and the life she was creating on her own terms. And as she drifted to sleep for the first time in months, Megan felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: peace. The courtroom was surprisingly quiet, the hum of distant conversations and the occasional rustle of papers the only sounds as Megan sat beside Charlotte. Across the room, Jake avoided her gaze, his jaw tight and his expression grim. The process had been swift, far more so than Megan had expected. Charlotte's meticulous work had ensured there were no surprises. Every attempt Jake made to challenge her claims had been struck down, his desperation laid bare with each passing day. Now, as the judge reviewed the final documents, Megan felt a strange mix of relief and finality. Mrs. Wallace, the judge said, glancing at her, you retain full ownership of the apartment and all associated assets. The financial accounts in question have been reconciled, and your former husband has no claim to them. The divorce is hereby granted. Do you have any questions before we conclude? No, Your Honor, Megan replied, her voice steady. The gavel struck and it was over. As Megan and Charlotte exited the courthouse, the bright sunlight seemed symbolic, as if the world itself was acknowledging the weight lifted from her shoulders. Charlotte grinned, slipping her sunglasses on. "It's done. You're free. Free." The word echoed in Megan's mind as they walked down the courthouse steps. She stopped to take a deep breath, letting the reality of the moment settle over her. "You okay?" Charlotte asked, her tone softening. Megan nodded. "Better than okay. It's just, I didn't realize how much I'd been compromising until now." Charlotte tilted her head, waiting for her to continue. "Jake had a way of making me feel small," Megan said. "It wasn't always obvious. Sometimes it was a joke, or a decision he made without asking. Other times, it was in the way he'd brush off my opinions like they didn't matter." She paused, her eyes scanning the bustling street in front of her. "And I let it happen. For years, I let myself believe that was normal, that it was my fault for not being enough. But you saw through it," Charlotte reminded her. "You stood up for yourself. That's what matters." Megan smiled faintly. "I guess I just didn't realize how much I'd lost until I started taking it back. My independence, my voice, my confidence. He made me think I needed him to make decisions, to feel secure. But the truth is, I'm stronger without him." Charlotte placed a hand on Megan's shoulder. "And you always were. He just didn't want you to see it." Megan felt a swell of gratitude for her friend, for the support that had carried her through this storm. "Thank you, Charlotte. For everything. That's what friends are for," Charlotte said with a wink. Later that evening, Megan returned to her apartment, the apartment that was now undeniably hers. She poured a glass of wine and sat by the window, watching the city lights shimmer against the dark sky. For the first time in years, she felt whole. She wasn't just free from Jake, she was free from the version of herself that had settled for less, that had believed she didn't deserve more. As she raised her glass, Megan made a silent vow. Never again would she let herself be undervalued. She was done compromising her worth for anyone. Her new life was just beginning. The morning sunlight spilled through the windows of Megan's apartment, casting warm, golden hues on the walls. She stood in the kitchen, sipping her coffee and marveling at the transformation around her. The space felt alive, vibrant, and uniquely hers. Every corner reflected her choices, her tastes, her freedom. She took a deep breath, letting the serenity of the moment wash over her. For the first time in years, there were no lingering doubts, no compromises weighing her down. This was her life, and she was fully in control of it. Her phone buzzed on the counter. It was a message from Charlotte. "Charlotte, brunch this weekend? You're overdue for some celebration mimosas. Bottle with popping cork." Megan smiled and replied with a thumbs up, tucking her phone into her pocket. She had plans now, plans for herself, for her friends, for her future. She walked to the living room, where her vision board leaned against the wall. It was covered with magazine clippings, sketches, and notes, a patchwork of dreams she'd been too afraid to pursue during her marriage. Now, those dreams felt within reach. Megan ran her fingers over one of the photos, a coastline she'd always wanted to visit. Italy. She'd never gone because Jake had dismissed it as impractical. Maybe next year, he'd always said, until the idea faded into the background. But not anymore. Megan picked up her laptop and began researching flights. She didn't need anyone's permission to chase her dreams. As the afternoon stretched on, she took her time arranging a few new plants on the windowsill. Each small act, choosing a pot, positioning a leaf just so, felt like a declaration of her independence. This was her sanctuary now, a place where she could nurture herself as she once nurtured everyone else. That evening, as the city lights flickered to life, Megan curled up on her new couch with a journal. She started to write, her pen gliding over the pages as she poured out her thoughts. "I didn't think I could do this. I didn't think I could rebuild myself after everything Jake took from me. But I did. And I'm stronger than I ever imagined. This apartment isn't just a home, it's a symbol of everything I've reclaimed. My peace, my joy, my power." She set the pen down and looked around the room, a small smile tugging at her lips. The pain and betrayal were still a part of her story, but they no longer defined her. Instead, they had become stepping stones to a brighter, stronger future. Megan walked to the window, her reflection faint against the city's glowing skyline. The woman staring back at her wasn't the same one who had hesitated, doubted, and compromised. This woman knew her worth. She raised her glass to the night, her heart swelling with triumph and peace. To new beginnings, she whispered. And as the stars sparkled above, Megan felt it in her bones. This was only the beginning of something extraordinary.